Welcome back to Controlling Ideas. Today, I'm very excited by our guest. His name is Matthew Dix. He is an author, a storyteller, a teacher. In fact, he has written one of my favorite storytelling books, Storyworthy. Matthew, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you. I'm so glad you like the book.
Oh, absolutely. There's one thing in the book that I really enjoyed. It's called the 5 second moment. Would you be able to just very quickly explain what the 5 second moment is?
Sure. I'm essentially it's understanding what a story is. It's the idea that every story worth telling essentially is about a moment of transformation in our lives, realization or transformation. I like to say we either view the world differently, or we suddenly change in some way. And I believe that all of those changes that take place are fundamentally instantaneous. They take place over the course of 5 seconds. The story is essentially leading me to the point that I actually had that shift, whether it's an enormous one or a small one. But ultimately, all of the changes in mindset, or the changes in ourselves, or the changes in the way we view the world, or our spouse, or our politicians, whoever they all take place instantaneously. And that's how stories should be told. That's what people want to hear. They want to hear about the moment when everything changed. The same thing that happens in movies. Characters don't gradually change over time. Things build up, tension is created, momentum happens, and then something breaks. That moment of breaking is really the most important part of the story. And that's often the end of the story. It really should be the end of the story. It's the most important thing you're going to say.
I love that. I always say that nobody enjoys a story about somebody that's awesome doing awesome things and just having an awesome life. It's
Yeah,
like
only your mother.
even at that, she gets a little bit sick of me, I
Yeah.
will say. Um, but you've been like helping everybody from entrepreneurs, business professionals, students with storytelling. Like, what are some of the misconceptions that you've seen about storytelling?
I think the biggest misconception is essentially, what is a story? So often, I think people view stories as stuff that happened to me over the course of time. And so there's no message, there's no point to the story. I'm not sort of trying to teach or preach in my stories. What I'm really trying to do is share an important moment from my life, trying to convey something of import that happened to me to someone else. And so often people think stories are a crazy thing happened to me, and therefore I have a story. And you really don't. You just have a crazy thing that happened to you, unless it fundamentally changes you in some significant way. It's fine for the golf course. It's fine for sitting next to a buddy and saying, "Hey, you're not going to believe what happened today." But those stories are forgettable. We those filter through us like they are nothing. The ones that stay with us are the ones where someone really expresses something important. And then the other thing is vulnerability. The idea that the best stories are the stories that we tell that are hard to tell. It's easy for me to tell the story about becoming an internationally best-selling novelist, but I will never tell that story for as long as I live, because no one really wants to hear that story. I'm looking to tell stories about moments of embarrassment, failure, shame. And even if I'm going to tell a success story, I'm going to make sure that that success is sort of the one small step on the path towards success, because that's going to be much more palatable, understandable than some grandiose story that talks about my incredible achievement. There's plenty of those in the world, and nobody really wants to hear them.
So it's more like getting the step in the right direction, more so than here's me like having this perfect idealized world just come about for me.
Yeah, if I was ever going to tell the story of becoming an internationally best-selling novelist, what I would essentially tell is the story of the phone call that I had at my desk at school one day when my agent called and said, "There may be a publisher interested in your first novel." End of story. Because people understand phone calls with promise, right? They've all received a phone call that has, opportunity or possibility at the end of that phone line. That is something that people will latch on to and connect with. And there's a degree of vulnerability there in that I'm not going to take it any further than that. If I go all the way to my books are published in 25 countries, no one's going to ever relate to that. No one's going to say, "Yes, my books have also been published in 25 countries, Matt. I fully appreciate what you're saying." So I'm always looking to get my story to the point that people will have a general and universal attachment to it, that they will somehow connect with it in a way that it means something to them. It reflects a part of their life, that kind of a thing.
I love that. And with so many different people telling so many different stories, like Is there any advice that you give to help people make their story like stand out as their own and stand out above like all of the other noise and information that's out there?
I think that if you start to understand that the stories we speak at their best create movies in the minds of the audience that listens to them. That's what we really want to do. We want people to kind of forget where they are and who they are really. We want them to get lost in their mind's eye rather than the eyes that, we can see on their face. And if you think of it that way and you think about it as film and you start to apply the principles of film to the principles of your stories, that's going to help you enormously. So, an easy one, the go-to one I tell people all the time is we have to tell our stories in scenes, which is to say our audience has to understand where we are physically in the world at all times. That creates a scene for our audience. That creates the opportunity for the audience to actually see us in space. And once they can see us in space, now there's a movie playing in their mind. That's the difference between, an actual story with a scene and location and something you can visualize versus a story that may begin with words like, let me tell you something about my mother, right? That does not create an image in anyone's mind, nor does it cause anyone to want to hear the next sentence you are about to speak. But so often people feel like they have to front load their stories with information before they launch the story. And that's just a terrible mistake that they make. I love the example I use as the Apollo 13 film. If you've ever seen that film, you kind of have to understand how 1960s space travel works in order to understand that film. But the movie doesn't open with Tom Hanks on a blank screen saying, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before you see this movie that we're about to show you, let me tell you a little bit about 1960s space travel," right? They teach you as the movie goes along, but that's how people mostly tell stories. They often say, before I start telling you my story, let me tell you a little bit about the town I grew up in, right? And that is not captivating in any way. Instead, teach me about the town you grew up in, but get the story started first. Give me a reason to be excited, to be wondering, to be in suspense, to be amused. All of those things work to grab an audience's attention and draw us into the story and start that movie in the mind's eye.
And when you're trying to start that movie in the mind's eye, are there any kind of specific considerations that storytellers should consider when thinking about what medium that they're communicating in? So if they're on stage versus like writing a book or using video or photos.
I think the only consideration I have is sort of how much you're going to provide in terms of detail. So I'm a novelist. When you pick up my novel, you have sort of committed a portion of your life to me, and
Mm.
I am able to give you lots and lots of specifics. In fact, that's what you expect in a novel. You don't want me to sort of brush by everything. You really want a fully realized world offered to you. In storytelling or even in video, what we want to understand is there's a certain level of attention that people will give you, and eventually that attention will wear off. With a novel, they can put the book down and come back to it later. That's the beauty of the novel. They can't put me down if I'm on stage. They can't like push me aside and then bring me back later. So in a novel, I may describe the small town with great detail because I want everyone to see it in their mind's eye. Whereas if I'm telling a story, I might just say, I grew up in a one streetlight town with a penny candy store on the corner. And that's all I'll say. And that will be enough for the audience to sort of fill in everything else for me. I'm allowing them to make enormous assumptions. And as long as like the general construction of my small town doesn't play a role in my story, that's perfectly fine for me. In fact, the power of their imagination will always be more powerful than my words. So if I want to have a story take place in a small town and I give them one traffic light and a penny candy store and they fill in the rest for me, I think that's fantastic. I am not attached to absolute 100% accuracy. You must see my small town in the way it really was, right? But that's how a lot of people are. They get really committed to details that mean something to them that they must learn mean nothing to the audience, right?
Mm.
We don't listen to stories for details. We've never had anyone say, boy, I wish that story had more details in it, right? Never in the history of the world has that happened. What people want is characters and dialogue and action. They want to be surprised. They want to be amused. They want suspense. And in the end, they want to have a moment of, oh, look at that. That guy is like me. Or I know a guy like him. Or that thing that happened to him, it once happened to me in a similar way. That's what people want from their story, not, the layout of Main Street. That is the last thing anyone wants.
It's funny when you were saying that. I was kind of thinking about some of my like favorite books that have been turned into movies, and I've almost been disappointed to see like it up on screen where it's like, oh, that's not the way I imagined it. That's
Yeah,
not like almost like that wasn't the movie in my head. I would have
right.
done it differently, you know? Even
Yeah,
though it's like pretty much using the same like kind of source material, if you know what I mean.
yeah. Well, I always acknowledge that when I'm telling a story, what my audience is seeing is never what I am seeing. You know, the garden at my grandmother's house is never going to look like the garden that they put in their head unless I spend a long period of time describing it, which I acknowledge nobody really wants. As long as they've got a garden of some kind, I'm comfortable with the idea that my story isn't about seeing a garden in its totality. A story is about, I'm going to tell you something meaningful that happened in my life and I'm going to entertain you along the way. And at the end, hopefully, you feel like you're a little closer to me. And if all those things happen, the scope and structure of the garden, all of those things are irrelevant.
That's fantastic. And, I think that's a very valuable lesson for a lot of businesses as well, where I know that so many people get into the weeds of their own product or their own uh, narrative of like where the businesses come from. They can almost overstuff their message so that people are like, this is too much. Like I hear what you're saying, but they're not like part of the story. Then it becomes like the business's story rather than somebody else's story for them to connect with.
Yeah, I tell people all the time, I believe in good hard nouns.
Hmm.
So you give a good hard noun that activates imagination, like garden activates imagination. People always say to me, your stories create so much of a visual in my mind. How do you manage to, create so many visuals? Like, what do you do? And I say, I don't use adjectives. As soon as I start using an adjective to describe something, I'm limiting their ability to imagine it. Whereas if I just use a noun like garden, I allow their imagination to run wild. And suddenly they actually think I have given them a garden to look at, when really what I've done is I've just asked them to put a garden into the story that they are familiar with. So it's their garden, it's their grandmother's garden, it's a garden they've seen on a TV show, whatever it is. They don't realize that they're doing all the work for me. I have simply prompted them with a good hard noun. And I do that all the time. If you listen to my stories, it's hard to find an adjective in my stories. I like really really specific nouns that create images in people's minds.
That is really insightful there. I'd love to like ask you just one last question, which is like you have so many great insights like this. What is your favorite story of one of your students or one of the entrepreneurs or professionals that you have connected with? What's your favorite story of one of them using your insights and seeing success from it?
It's a great question. No one's ever asked me that. I guess it's not maybe my favorite, but it's the one I've been thinking about a lot, possibly for vulnerability reasons, really. I worked with a doctor once. He was a pediatrician, and he had a child, and his wife was one of these mothers who would not allow her husband to be alone with the child. These mothers exist in the world, these overly protective mothers. I've met them before.
Hmm.
And so it wasn't, and the father's a pediatrician. So it wasn't until the son was 3 years old that the mother finally said, okay, I'm going out with my friends and you can stay home with our son. It was sort of the first time she had really let that boy out of her sight. And 15 minutes after she had left, the boy fell down a set of stairs and broke his leg. Now, the pediatrician father didn't know the boy broke his leg. He was complaining that his leg hurt and he was sort of hopping around on it. And he's like, don't tell mom. Like, just walk it off, buddy, walk it off. And he couldn't walk it off. And finally, the wife came home and she said, why is he limping? And he's like, that's nothing. And the next day, they found out the leg was broken. And I loved the story. It's so simple. He barely describes anything in the story. He gives me a house with a set of stairs, and that's really all you need is a house with a set of stairs. A couple rooms, fall down some stairs. That's the end of it. But I love it because it's so vulnerable. I mean, this is a pediatrician who takes care of hundreds of children every year, and yet the first time he is left alone with his son, the kid falls down the stairs, breaks his leg, and then doesn't even get diagnosed until the next day. I just think that when we're looking to tell stories, those are the stories we want to hear. I don't want to hear the story about the doctor who saved the child's life. That's wonderful, and I'm glad he saved the child's life, but I can't relate to that. But stupid parenting blunders, I totally understand that. Wives who sometimes think, I'm not quite trustworthy enough to make a certain decision. I understand that completely. I connected immediately to his story because I understand what it is like to feel like you can do something and then suddenly just drop the ball in a way that is unconscionable. And that's what I loved about that story. And he's a doctor telling that story, which is, he's got to keep his clients and he's got to keep his patients and everyone happy. And he's daring enough to do that. And I just thought it was brilliant.
That is brilliant. And Matthew, I know you're exceptionally busy, and I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time out to chat to me and to chat to this audience. So, what is next for you? Anything that we should check out, keep an eye out for?
Well, we're producing shows. My wife and I run an organization called Speak Up, and we used to do them in big theaters for hundreds of people, and now we do them on the internet until we can get back into those theaters. And I teach workshops, and I used to again fly around the country and teach those, in person, and now I teach them online, which I thought I was going to hate, and it turns out it's pretty great. When I sit down on a Tuesday night and I have 6 people in a workshop that I'm working with intensely and they are on 4 different continents. It's really amazing. That's something that's never happened for me before, but it's happening now. So a tiny silver lining in this disaster of a pandemic that we're having right now. So if you just go to my website, matthewdix.com, you can find all of those things that we're doing. I have a novel coming out in January as well. There's always something happening. As my wife says, there's always something.
That's fantastic. Matthew, thank you so much again. We'll make sure to link to matthewdix.com in the description here. But thank you so much again.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Always happy to do these things.